Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Tuesday, July 23rd around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the Big Ten Media Days. They start in Indianapolis today. I'll break down the biggest talking points as I see it as we go into this week that is just going to be absolutely jam-packed up there in Indianapolis. Then we had some news from the ACC Media Days that started yesterday. It sounds like Florida State and Clemson are staying put, at least for the time being, in that conference through the 2025-26 season, and that does answer one of the questions, but brings up a ton of more questions around that, so we'll break down all of those today. Then we'll get into kind of an interesting trend around first-year quarterbacks, whether that be transfer or freshman quarterbacks that come in, and how successful they can be their first year. And we'll break down how I see the big-time transfer quarterbacks or the big-time quarterbacks going into a new system will fare this upcoming season. Then we'll get into the Big 12 to kind of finish out the show. We'll do hinge players in that conference, have 6 guys that I want to break down for you all. Then we'll finish out the hot takes for the contenders in that conference where there are just so many. So we'll break down all of the guys that you need to know and definitely a hot take around all of them. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show. And the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcspodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always good for the both of us. Again, if you want to use that, that's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in. Let's talk about the Big Ten Media Days. They kick off today in Indianapolis, and there's a ton to talk about. Unlike the ACC, most of the things are on the field, which is a very nice thing in today's age, but there are so many things to break down for this week, and definitely, to me, it starts with the Ohio State Buckeyes. But let's start to break down this schedule real quick, and Ohio State kicks off today. We will get to hear from Ryan Day today. We'll also get to hear from Luke Fickell over at Wisconsin, which will be very, very interesting to hear from. Greg Schiano really has things rolling at Rutgers. Would be fascinating to hear from him. And then David Braun, someone at Northwestern who took over in very, very interesting circumstances a year ago, did a fantastic job throughout the 2023 season, and is going into the season with some questions, no two ways about that, but definitely a lot of energy around that program. You also have Illinois and Purdue going on today, so if you want to check that out today. Then tomorrow you'll have Indiana with their new head coach Kirk Cignetti coming over from JMU after just a remarkable year. Mike Locksley is really heating up the recruiting trail. It will be fascinating to hear from him. Sharon Moore will be the main event for the most part. Definitely a huge amount of questions around him and how he's going to kind of handle this next little bit. Then you have, obviously, PJ Fleck, who's going to be massive to watch. Definitely will be super, super interesting and see how that unfolds. Dan Lanning is going to be another one that everyone's going to want to watch. And then Jed Fish absolutely will be interesting. And then Iowa, Michigan State, Nebraska, Penn State, UCLA, and USC will finish out the week. And you'll have Iowa will definitely be really interesting to hear from. Jonathan Smith taking over at Michigan State. Matt Rule obviously going into a huge year at Nebraska. And then Penn State and USC definitely have a lot to prove, and just cannot wait to hear from Deshaun Foster for the very first time as the UCLA head coach. But let's start to jump into the biggest talking points as we head into this week, and it starts with the team that everyone's been talking about this entire offseason, really, and that's the Ohio State Buckeyes. Everyone is talking about this team, and everyone expects this team to be a national title contender. And not only that, but if they don't win one, there will be people saying it is a failure out there. There's no two ways about that. It's not the case, but there will be people that will be saying that. There is a ton going into this week, obviously. Will Howard is not going to be there, which is kind of unfortunate. In fact, there's only 5 quarterbacks across all 18 teams that will actually be in attendance, so kind of an interesting one. Hudson Card's the only one that's played Big Ten football before, so a very, very interesting kind of crop of quarterbacks there this week. But we'll still get to hear from a ton of people. Emeka Egbuka will be there, and he'll give as much good info of how far along Will Howard is as anyone. And maybe if someone else is maybe a little bit further along than Will Howard is right now, I think Will Howard is definitely the guy as of right this second. But who knows what the leash is. So we'll definitely get a little bit of an idea with that. And then how he kind of fits into Chip Kelly's offense will be very interesting to hear from. Also, we'll get to hear from Denzel Burke and Jack Sawyer. This will be awesome to hear from, especially Denzel Burke, in my opinion, because he'll get to give us an idea of how Caleb Downs is fitting in, how that back end is looking, and right now on paper it looks just absolutely ridiculous. So you add someone like Caleb Downs, it'll be really fascinating to hear from him. So it'll be really, really awesome to hear from all these guys, and I think one of the biggest things I want to hear, frankly, is I want these guys to be crazy confident, like a little bit arrogant, honestly, in the way that they answer questions about what they expect from this season, because that's the way they should be approaching this season. They are the team to beat. They are the most talented team in the country, and there's a lot of juice around that program. So I feel like they need to come in with just a little bit of arrogance and definitely be a little bit overly confident in some respects, but definitely be a team that walks in with their head held high, with their chest out, and say, no one's going to beat us this upcoming year. So definitely will be a really interesting thing to watch from that respect. And then you got some new teams joining the party, and particularly Oregon will absolutely be the topic of conversation. We'll get to hear from Dan Lanning, which will be fascinating to hear about the recruiting he's been doing over the last little bit, and some rumors around Phil Knight and NIL, but those are kind of goofy in and of itself. And then you have Dylan Gabriel will be in attendance, which will be awesome to hear how he's filling into Will Stein's offense. Jeffrey Bossa will also be there, and that's the leader of this defense. So we'll get to hear a lot of the different things about the transfers that came in, how they're affecting the defense, how the defense is looking coming up to the season, and if they've taken the steps forward in the places they need to really compete this upcoming season. But then you have some other teams. Obviously, you have USC, and it's definitely going to be really interesting to hear from Lincoln Riley. It's obviously not been the greatest summer months for the USC program, but still a lot of things to like over there. Miller Moss is going to be there, which is a huge thing because there was still part of me that thought Jade Mayava had a shot to be the starter at the beginning of the season. That's totally put to rest now. It will be Miller Moss trotting out there. Jonah Monaheim is one of the best offensive linemen in the country, will be there. But then Kamari Ramsey, the safety, is the guy that I really want to hear from because I want to hear what DeAnton Lynn has, how that defense is kind of being put into place, and how the energy around that defense should be or is a little bit different this upcoming year. So definitely will be fascinating to hear from all of those guys, but it sounds like we know the starter for USC at the very least for the upcoming season. Then we also got UCLA and Washington. Probably won't get too much coverage. Obviously, Jed Fish at Washington will be very interesting to watch. It definitely will be fascinating to hear from him about that transition from Arizona to Washington. And then UCLA with a new head coach. I'm very excited to see Deshaun Foster, but they will definitely not be at the very top of the headlines. I can almost promise you that. But then let's move right along here, and Sherrone Moore has a ton of questions that are going to be really, really interesting to hear him answer, and this would be number one on the list if there weren't so many other things to talk about in this conference. But he's taken over for the reigning national champion and a guy that really is maybe one of the best coaches in that school's history in Jim Harbaugh. I'm sure a lot of Michigan fans would tell you that. And they're bringing three guys from Michigan: Donovan Edwards, Max Bredesen, and Makari Page. So we won't get to hear from Alex Orji or any of the quarterbacks, but Donovan Edwards and Max Bredesen will give us plenty to know about Alex Orji, about Jack Tuttle, about which one they feel a little bit more confident in. And then Makari Page is really interesting to me because Wink Martindale is coming in as the defensive coordinator, and he's kind of a wild card in some senses. I mean, he's a fantastic football mind, and I have very little doubt that they're going to be a really good defense, but they're going to be a little bit different, I would have to imagine, and definitely be a little bit more... You know what, I don't really know what the overall differences will be, but it definitely will be really interesting to hear from Makari Page about what those differences are, how they go about business, and how Wink Martindale is kind of taking the NFL approach and bringing it down to Ann Arbor, and see how that really works this upcoming season. And then obviously Nebraska. It's going to be a huge topic of conversation. This is one that absolutely would be a bigger topic of conversation if Ohio State and Oregon and Michigan weren't clogging the top of this conference. But the reality is it'll be fascinating to hear from Matt Rule about where is Dylan Raiola at? Is he, further along than he thought? Is he right on schedule where he thought? Is he, a little bit behind? Which is understandable as being a freshman coming in. Ben Scott, the starting center, will be there, which will be really interesting to hear from him because he has a very unique perspective on the quarterbacks and gets to work with a lot of these guys. So he might be able to give us as much information about Dylan Weile's development as really anyone. So that'll be fascinating to watch. And then you have Isaac Gifford and Ty Robinson coming in from the defensive side of the ball. And frankly, I don't really have a lot of questions about their defense going into this year. They're going to be good. I have very few doubts about that, but it'll be interesting to hear from them about how they feel going into this season, how some of the new transfers are filling in, and all of that different stuff. So it'll be fascinating to hear from all of those guys, but at the end of the day, Matt Rule is going to be the show. He's going to be the guy that everyone's looking at to say, how is Dylan Raiola looking? How are the transfer wide receivers looking? How is Bly Hill on the back end of that defense looking? Tommy, all of these guys that are being put together for a huge season, hearing him kind of talk about this team will at least give us an idea of how confident he is in this team. And then, I apologize for that. And then we obviously have a number of things to talk about, Penn State being a huge one. Definitely will be really interesting to hear from James Franklin about just how everything is going, how those coordinators especially are fitting in. Tom Allen and Andy Kotelnicki coming in are going to be absolutely huge for this team. They actually, frankly, I think are probably the two most important people on the team. So it'll be really, really interesting to hear from those guys. Drew Aller is someone that will not be in attendance, which is rather upsetting, frankly. I'd love to hear from him, but Tyler Warren will be there, the veteran tight end, so he'll give us a good idea of how Drew Aller's doing, how his confidence is kind of building up going into the season. And then Jalen Reed, the really talented safety that they have. It's going to be interesting to see how he speaks about Tom Allen and the way that they're going about business on the defensive side of the ball this upcoming year, because it's going to be a little bit different. Manny Diaz and him, they're similar defenses, but not necessarily the same by any means, so it'll be fascinating to hear the ers and ahs that have been added to that defense. And then on top of that, you have other talking points like Iowa's revamped offense will be interesting to hear about. Kurt Cignetti making his debut at Indiana will be fascinating to hear from him. Wisconsin moving forward, trying to be a little bit more of a contender in this. And then obviously, we're always on the lookout for any house settlement updates or possible revenue split updates, that type of thing. So it'll be really, really interesting to see kind of how all of this fits and all of the different talking points going into this season. But at the end of the day, it is going to be fascinating to hear from all of these different guys and hear how this conference is shaping up going into this season, because it's one of the weirder ones around the country, definitely, and definitely one that is a little bit up in the air. It'll be really fascinating to see what happens. And I think Anthony asks a great question here. I think Ryan Day's scheme is different. There's no two ways about that. Handing it over to Chip Kelly is a little bit different of a scheme as well, and a little bit more run heavy, although it's a little bit more finesse runs type thing, a little bit more jet sweeps, some, option type plays, different things like that. So frankly, I think Ohio State will be a little bit more run heavy this upcoming year, and I think it'll really benefit them because not only who they have at running back, but also the quarterback Will Howard can definitely scoot a little bit. So although yes, Ryan Day's philosophy, his scheme, the way he goes about business on offense is definitely different and may have hurt him the last couple of years in the Big Ten. I think they'll get a little bit closer to everyone else in the Big Ten this upcoming year while still staying just different enough with the wide receivers they have on the edge. But at the end of the day, it's going to be awesome to hear from all of these guys, and will be really interesting for the next 3 days to unpack all of the things that come out from this. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Florida State and Clemson. They are staying put in the ACC for now. We will break down all of the different questions that come from this and how it's not that great of a thing for the ACC, but we'll break that down right after this.